Associate Professor of Organizational Management and Business Studies Department Chair at Midland College. Today we have three scholars. We have three scholars, let's see, this is 5E. So 5E, International Dimensions and Concerns Regarding the Fall of South Vietnam. So again, I am Dr. San Mai, and today we have three scholars that will be discussing international perspectives of the end of the Vietnam conflict. I actually found this area to be interesting, and one of the reasons why I selected to be a commentator on this is that a few years ago, I was browsing through WikiLeaks, and one of the things I did was look at 1975 South Vietnam, and you can kind of see how diplomacy gets wrapped up at the end of the Vietnam conflict. For instance, an ambassador over here, ambassador over there, kind of closing down embassies, and so that kind of brought me some interest in this area here. So again, today we have three scholars, and the first scholar is Walter Brouwer, and Walter Brouwer is with the University of New Brunswick in Canada. He received a BA from the University of Brunswick with a major in history and political science, and he also received a master's of history there. Our second scholar is, if I butcher your name, I apologize, Jerema Slowiak. Dr. Slowiak is at Jagiellonian University at Krakow in Poland. And we also have Dr. Laura Calkins. And Dr. Laura Calkins, whom I've known many years, is at Texas Tech University. So what I'll do is I'll have the presentations by seating order from my right to left. I'll allow 20 minutes for each presentation. As the time nears, again, I'll wave you down around the 3-minute mark. And afterwards, we'll have time for Q&A. All right, so again, the first scholar is Professor Brouwer, and his presentation is entitled, When Does the War End? Canada and the Vietnam War.
Before I begin, I'm very thankful for the promotion to professor, but I'm still just a master's student. So, when do wars end and for whom? This was one of the questions that came to mind while I was working on my thesis, which focuses on Canadian soldiers in the International Commission in Vietnam. For Canada, the war ended in 1973, when its government decided to stop participating in the International Commission for Supervision and Control. The fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, is the date historians have assigned to the end of the Vietnam War itself. But did that day end the war? For Canada, it marked its re-involvement. For hundreds and thousands of Vietnamese people, the war transformed into a new struggle for survival. I hope to include this conference paper in a wider research project focusing on Canada's long-term participation and interaction with the Vietnam War. Now. Okay. You'll, awesome, thank you. Canada's involvement in the Vietnam War began with the signing of the 1954 Geneva Accords, which established the International Commission. Between 54 and 56, the Commission oversaw prisoner exchanges and was responsible for ensuring that all parties were complying with the agreement. In 1956, they were meant to oversee a national election, where the Vietnamese would decide whether they would reunite under the communist or democratic governments. These elections didn't happen, and conflict returned to Vietnam. From 56 until 73, Canada and their fellow Commission members would continue to try their best to fulfill the Commission's mandate, while also trying to fulfill their own private Cold War objectives. For Canada, meeting these wider objectives included gathering intelligence on North Vietnam and on the Polish commissioners. The Commission transformed in '73 when the United States began its withdrawal from Vietnam. Next one. The Paris Peace Accords, signed on January 27, 1973, transformed the ICSC into the ICCS, the International Commission for Control and Supervision, which is kind of stupid for switching around two words. And Canada was again approached to participate in overseeing the new peace agreement. However, Canada expected the Paris Peace Agreement would fail in a similar manner, as the 1954 agreement did. Newspaper reports from 1973 stated that Mitchell Sharp, the then Canadian Secretary for External Affairs, expressed serious doubts about the efficacy of the new commission and would have Similarly, Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, the then Prime Minister, stated, "You can't go there to maintain a peace among parties who haven't got peaceful intentions." Canada agreed to participate, but only for 60 days, and reserved the right to withdraw at any time. It seems that Canada's disillusionment with the ICCS, however, was overruled by a single factor: its allyship to the United States. According to Frank Bryant, a Canadian veteran of the mission and commissioner, he believed that Canada's motivation to signing on was so that it could help the US pull out in a safer and more streamlined fashion. In a similar vein, the Hungarian delegation blamed Canada for the ICCS's inaction, accusing Canada of collusion with the United States. The 60-day exit clause would also line up perfectly with the US timeline. However, Canada extended its initial 60-day withdrawal in March. Again, whether this was because the smooth operation of the US exit had generated a little optimism in Canada, or because Canada wanted to avoid accusations of partisanship, is something that's still unclear. Nevertheless, the disinterest the warring parties had in Vietnam had in peace, and the frustration of a continually deadlocked ICCS eventually took its toll. On May 29th, Canada announced it would exit Vietnam. Can I have the next slide, please? Canada's exit from Vietnam was a largely uneventful affair. The biggest event that caught headlines during the exit period was the kidnapping of Captains Ian Patton and Fletcher Thompson on the 20th of June. Both were released 17 days later. On July 29th, the Canadian contingent held a farewell party for themselves. On the 30th, they prepped their baggage for transport, and many apparently opted to wear bathing suits instead of uniforms that day. One of the captains was also quoted as saying, "I'm going out to the airstrip and sit under the wing of a plane until it's time to board." Canada couldn't wait to get out of there. I personally believe that Canada's lax attitude in these last hours displayed their view of the Commission at this point in time. It wasn't worth their time anymore, and most sense of professionalism is out the door. Canadians were just looking forward to going home, and since Canada's low expectations have been proven right. Canada's last few hours in Vietnam thus progressed like such. On July 31st, at 0500, the Canadian contingent woke up. At 0700, the flag was raised for the last time at the Commission headquarters. At 0800, the flag was lowered for the last time. And at 0815, at the request of the South Vietnamese, the Canadian contingent lined up to shake hands with South Vietnamese Lieutenant General, and I'm sorry for butchering this, Phan Quoc Thuan, while a brass band played Auld Lang Syne in the background. At 0830, the contingent boarded buses, which took them to two Royal Canadian Air Force Boeing 707s, which flew them home. Before the sun was even high in the sky, Canada had left Vietnam behind. Due to the time difference, that same morning, the contingent landed in Vancouver, British Columbia, greeted by a brass band, military and government officials, reporters, and family members. A week later, though, the ICSC seemed to have largely vanished from the Canadian public consciousness, and any news still circulating about Canada's mission in Vietnam was largely relegated to side articles away from the front pages. Canada's involvement ended with a sigh of relief. We then promptly forgot our presence in Vietnam so thoroughly that most Canadians have forgotten Canada's role in Vietnam. But while the war, excuse me, but while the war ended for Canada, it was still raging in Vietnam. For another 638 days after Canada left, the war continued, but largely on the periphery of the Canadian consciousness, as Canada prioritized its Atlantic relationships. But on April 30th, 1975, Canada was pulled back into the war via the refugee crisis it spawned. Canada's initial response to the crisis could only be described as tragic when compared to the United States. On April 22nd, when Vietnamese people came to the Canadian embassy for assistance to evacuate, embassy staff turned every single person away, including those who had worked for the embassy and faced serious risk of repercussions. Many were told to come back the next day. However, by then, all the staff would have been evacuated back to Canada, leaving no one behind. Canada even prioritized flying back an embassy car over evacuating people. 0 people were in Canada that day. Canadian officials defended their decision and argued that Vietnamese embassy staff faced no real risk of persecution and that Canada could not have helped everyone to leave. The Province, a newspaper in British Columbia, wrote that the Canadian government's response was, or bordered on the contemptible. These excuses were lambasted by the newspapers. One article published stated, "Nobody expected Canada to get everyone who would like to go, but there's no excuse for refusing to take anybody." I think I'm one slide ahead. Between American operations Frequent Wind and New Life, and through their means of their own, around 130,000 Vietnamese people were evacuated from Vietnam to American bases in Guam, Wake, and California. The largest number of refugees landed in Guam, from where the vast majority would eventually be resettled in the United States. But some chose or were selected to resettle in other nations, one of these being Canada. The government response improved in May, but still left a lot to be desired. It seemed Canada was unhappy with having to help deal with the fallout of the war. On May 1st, the Canadian Immigration Minister, Robert Andres, announced that Canada would sponsor only 3,000 refugees, but promised that they would move very quickly to bring them into Canada. It was not a very quick response. First, Canada would prioritize refugees who already had family living in the country, severely limiting who could apply. A Vancouver Sun article, published in May 15th, 1975, mentions how Canadian immigration officers in Camp Pendleton continually rejected refugees. Quoting one of the immigration officials, "There have probably been 5 or 6 people a day coming in here who have been seeking to enter Canada, although they don't have any blood relatives." Second, pure bureaucratic processes further slowed down the smooth intake of refugees. The first group of refugees that were meant to arrive in Canada on May 4th were bumped from their flight, and at no point did Canada offer any of its own planes to transport the refugees. To Canada's credit, though, they were the only non-US country, as far as I can tell, that established an immigration office in Camp Pendleton, California, to speed up the process, as well as send officials to Guam to assist those who did qualify for entry to Canada. But even that must be taken with a grain of salt, when according to my current research, the immigration office in Hamilton consisted of a single small trailer and only 3 officials. Yeah, no, I'm ahead in slides, I'm sorry. Can we go back one? It would take time for the Canadian government to make a serious commitment. But by the end of May, Canada had agreed to accept up to 15,000 Vietnamese, with 2,700 already having entered the country. However, at the end of 1975, that number of refugees stalled around 6,000. Those who managed to make landfall in Canada were happy to have arrived, Newspaper outlets printed stories highlighting the relief of many refugees who were reunited with families and were generally happy to finally be able to begin rebuilding their lives. But having to start from scratch is never easy, and a lot of refugees arrived with nothing more than the clothes on their back. Most of them would also experience difficulties finding gainful and long-term employment in Canada, despite many being fluent in French and highly educated. Even the experience of gaining refuge itself tore multiple families apart. Just like when Canada left in 1973, many refugees could not escape the fallout of the war, even though they had left Vietnam behind them. The influx of refugees fell drastically in 1976 when Canada admitted less than 700 Vietnamese into the country, a staggeringly low amount when considering the large number of refugees who were still living in refugee camps in Hong Kong, Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines, or were still stuck inside Vietnam. This could potentially be attributed to the controversy surrounding South Vietnamese General Dang Van Quang in 1975. He was fast-tracked into Canada at the request of the United States as a family living in Montreal. Refugees who recognized him accused him of political corruption and drug trafficking at the highest level of government. This created a large debate in Canada, with many demanding his extradition. In July 1975, the government ordered his deportation, but this was delayed as the United States refused to house him, and Canada did not want to send him back to Vietnam. But Canadian sympathies would begin to shift again in 1978. When Malaysia refused to let the Hai Hong, a boat carrying 2,500 Vietnamese refugees, dock, the government of Canada admitted 600, while the rest were granted refuge in other nations. A total of 9,000 and about 60 refugees would enter Canada through government programs before 1979, when the floodgates of Canadian support were opened. This was because a new immigration policy was passed just a year prior that would allow private citizens to sponsor refugee groups. Before the UN conference on refugees and displaced persons was held, Canada announced it would admit 50,000 refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. 25,000 were to be sponsored by the government, while the other half would be supported by private organizations, or by groups of at least 5 individuals. These private groups would agree to provide refugees with food, housing, financial support, and settlement support for an entire year. And some groups would continue to support certain refugees for up to 2 years. The big national spark, though, seems to have occurred with the creation of Operation Lifeline, created in the living room of Dr. Howard Edelman, a university professor in Toronto, on June 10th, 1979. Because by the end of the month, that same organization had 66 chapters around the country. While there were many initiatives already in progress, only a few grew to the same size and level of organization as Operation Lifeline. In total, around 7,000 private groups sprang into existence around Canada to assist refugees from Southeast Asia. By 1980, private sponsor groups had supported over 34,000 refugees, while the government had sponsored 26,000. Unlike 1975, though, the effort did not stop after a single year. By 1986, 140,000 refugees from Southeast Asia had entered Canada, the majority of them Vietnamese. The UN actually presented the people of Canada with the Nansen Refugee Medal for their efforts, the only nation to have received it as a collective. Canadians and Vietnamese refugees who managed to establish themselves continued to work to bring in more refugees well into the 90s. In total, a little under 200,000 Vietnamese refugees would find a new home in Canada, but many of them would face greater struggle than those who came in 1975. Because of the horrendous experiences many faced during their escape or being stuck in a refugee camp, many after a study, many had said that many suffered from survivor's guilt and PTSD. Furthermore, those who had gained entry to Canada post-1979 spoke very little English or French and had more significant difficulties finding work because of it. Those who did manage to find employment often worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, while at the same time they took English classes and night classes so they could move up the economic ladder. Not to mention the difficulty of finding a balance between maintaining Vietnamese cultural traditions and trying to fit in with Canadian norms. Despite that, as time passed, many established stable lives in Canada. The title of this presentation is When Does the War End? Canada and the Vietnam War. In the Canadian experience, the war ended in 1973 when it pulled out of the ICCS and regulated Vietnam to the periphery of the national and government consciousness. The war returned to the forefront of Canada's attention briefly in 1975 when the first wave of refugees entered. A token amount of people was let in with the controversy created by the admission of General Van Quang into Canada, who was accused of multiple war crimes, it became easily to sideline Vietnam again. But in 1979, Canada finally mobilized to confront the fallout from the Vietnam War head-on and continue to stay engaged. It is difficult then to pinpoint exactly when the war ended for Canada, especially when we consider that many Vietnamese people pursued Canadian citizenship as soon as they were eligible, much like the United States. Many found a place in Canada, and their scars became a part of our national identity as well. In 2015, Canada passed the Journey to Freedom Act, making April 30th an official day of commemoration for Vietnamese refugees who suffered or died to escape Vietnam. In 2023, the events of 1979 were designated a National Historic Event by the Government of Canada. The fallout of the war is still fresh in the minds of many Canadians, as it is for Americans. Coming from a Canadian perspective and Canada's interaction with the Vietnamese people, these questions still come to mind. Is the war over when a nation leaves the war zone, or when the bullets stop? Or does it end when a refugee finally finds a new home, or when the last painful memory is forgotten? These are just a few of the many questions I'm left with and hoping to find insight to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Walter, for also introducing us to the international commissions, because that saves me a bit of time. So I will be talking about the last months of Polish delegation in South Vietnam. So I also would like to show you when to change the slides, so I would like this. Yeah, so the Poles also arrived in Vietnam in 1954. They were in the whole region, because also in Laos and Cambodia, and participated in work of all international commissions in Indochina. Their presence in both parts of Vietnam at first glance gave them unique access, position to information, to obtain information both south and in North Vietnam. Then they, of course, transitioned into another commission, as Walter already mentioned. Control and supervision was swapped, but Poles effectively remained the same. The delegation was a bit bigger. But going back to those
supposedly unique opportunities for Poles. In reality, those opportunities were quite limited. In the north, Poles were kept in isolation just like all other socialist friends, because actually being a friend of North Vietnamese didn't give you any special privileges in North Vietnam. They were often asked also by North Vietnamese for favors during their work in those commissions. In the south, they were perceived as communists, as an adversary, and thus under tight observation and invigilation both by South Vietnamese and also Americans. At the same time, after 1973, PRG representatives repeatedly asked for things that were not exactly the statutory work, Polish statutory work in the commission itself. In the end, while the Polish position in Vietnam indeed was unique, it actually didn't provide those multiple advantages that sometimes they were suspected of, especially by Americans. As such, this Polish proverbial crystal ball about the end of Vietnam War did not foresee the scale and success of the communist offensive in March 1975, and only after this disastrous route from the Central Highlands that was described yesterday in such details, and the loss of the northern provinces, the possibility of the imminent fall of the South Vietnam actually became a possibility in Polish reports sent back to Warsaw. But even at the beginning of the April, the most probable turn of events in Polish reports foresaw something similar to the result of the Eastern Offensive in 1972. So, American air power again turning the turn of battle, exhaustion and overstretched communist forces, and some kind of another army site or simply post in large-scale operations. From Polish perspective, in the beginning of the April in 1975, United States invested too much and were involved too deep in Indochina and South Vietnam to actually allow Saigon to fall. And also Saigon forces, despite being weakened, still represented being quite potent adversary, unlikely in Polish perception to quickly crumble with the US support. As such, in reports sent back to Warsaw, the military events of March and April 1975 are called extraordinary and unforeseen war events. Of course, Polish military later carried out studies about what happened in 1975, but those do not go beyond things that are usually written about those events, only maybe flavored with some kind of additional spice of communist rhetoric and propaganda. If you could change slide. But of course, we have some kind of, there were studies in 1980s, there was a PhD work written in the Felix Dzierżyński Political Military Academy. We could change, there will be several maps that were prepared to show how the offensive found out. If you could change the slide. Yeah, because there will be several about, for fighting in Central Highlands, the loss of the northern part of the South Vietnam, change. Also the right operation Central Highlands. Also, change. Yeah, Kill Da Nang, and retreat of the using the sea route. Change. And of course, the final operation Ho Chi Minh and attack on Saigon, and the evacuation of what we know as a frequent wing. Integral part, you could say, of the Polish delegation in Vietnam was done, but the Polish military intelligence took part of constructing the Polish delegation from the very beginning, from 1954, and while present in 1954, actually the very first limited intelligence activities were carried out only in 1963 at Soviet request, because before that it was strictly prohibited by Warsaw to do any kind of spy work in South Vietnam. And small residentura was established under the cover of Polish delegation in 1967. Change the slide. And I think it's telling that one of the reasons for establishing the residentura, beside the classic spy work, was actually to verify the claims of the Vietnamese communists, because the flow of information was such that Warsaw did not believe what Hanoi was saying, more or less. It could be said. And in 1973, with new delegation, new commission, there was also new, bigger, more robust presidentura. So, you know, Eastern synonym for the station, like CIA station, right? Communist countries had residenturas. So this was a larger, more robust, prepared residentura, codenamed Paul, or Paul III, if you want. And by 1975, of course, this was reduced in size, but still Residentura was composed of 8 military officers, and they were sometimes aided by 4 other individuals. And those were the tasks for 1975. So, obtaining, analyzing, and sending to Poland information, materials, and models of Western weapons and military equipment, and obtaining those things were always the priority of Poles in Vietnam. Obtaining, compiling, transmitting information and materials for intelligence situation, establishing contact with people from Western countries for information and profiling purposes, cooperation with Hungarian military intelligence in the ICES delegation, and maintaining relations with PRG officials. And we will get both to Hungarians and PRG representatives in a moment. So there were, of course, some areas of interest in 1975 that were particularly emphasized. Development of political and military situation in South Vietnam from perspective of Poles was quite interesting. Okay, so the information work, which was the main area of activities of the Residentura Palm, is described for the period, it's for 74, 75, because the one of the turn of the Residentura, this third term, how do you call it? The change of people in the Polish delegation was from, I think, August 74 to March 75. So there was also another smaller contingent of Polish military officers, but still it involves 75. So they delivered those 127 information reports. What I think is quite interesting are those 51 samples of weapons and military equipment, because at that point also were quite isolated, observed almost daily, 24 hours a day. So it's quite interesting that they were still able to obtain, well, for example, the 70mm rocket. Of course, it's not the most sophisticated military equipment, but still, I think it's quite interesting that at that point they were still able to obtain such things. In addition, Residentura also sent to Warsaw 364 information telegrams that were used to prepare daily up-to-date memos for military and party leadership. Also, of course, the Residentura prepared studies and reports, and those didn't envisage the fall of South Vietnam up to the middle of the April, actually. So we, for example, have study on the framework for the economic and commercial development of Republic of South Vietnam, new economic era for 1976-1980. So they saw the existence of Vietnam, South Vietnam, in that, at least for those years. And what we have on the screen, so plan of the repression against the opposition in South Vietnam. I think it's also quite telling that communist Poles paid close attention to South Vietnam security apparatus. It was of great interest for them, both because it was used against them, but also because they sought useful tips and procedures how that could be used to strengthen their own grip on society in Poland. So, despite being on the other side of ideological scale, they wanted to learn from experience of South Vietnam, you could say. And, by 1975, the operation conditions were described as difficult and deteriorating as a result of the increasingly difficult situation of the Saigon government, which resulted in the introduction of new orders, prohibitions, and restrictions. We can also see that deterioration of the political and military situation in South Vietnam resulted in the number of studies and reports about political, military and economic situation that was prepared by this Polish Residentura, because in early March there are 21 reports and a month later we only have 5 of those. Also because the regional groups of Polish delegation, when the officers of military intelligence were also posted, they were evacuated to Saigon, so they didn't have access to all those previous information. Polish officers were also working on the local American community, you could say, sorting out candidates of intelligence interest and trying to identify those with links to the secret services. As such, they prepared several dozens of personal profiles, mainly about people who were perceived as members of American secret services, like you can see here. Thomas Folgar was actually, I think he was a CIA station chief. Here he is as a deputy, but in other document he is identified correctly as a station chief. And in 1975, the Residentura Palm Tree also pointed out that due to ongoing mass immigration of Vietnamese to capitalist countries, mainly United States and France, there is a possibility for penetration of such communities and using them in intelligence work in capitalist countries, but also in Indochina and China. So this rivalry or adversary position with China is still present, and there is a possibility of using Vietnamese in that work. The political and economic situation of Vietnamese immigrant communities might be favorable to profiling and recruitment work, which is a quote from a Polish document. And also Polish officers kept working on their contacts with the, for example, second secretary of the US Embassy in Saigon, Edward J. Smith, who had a code name of politician in those contacts in Polish documents. He was earlier used as an information source, and also Mr. Theodore C. Pauling, who had a code name economist. So there were Americans who somehow established closer ties with Polish military intelligence officers. And also, in regard of those contacts with Americans, on the 13th of April, there was an incident in Saigon in which Polish officer, Lieutenant Colonel Belkovich, had his camera stolen on the Saigon street by 2 Vietnamese on motorcycle, and Poles perceived that this incident was actually a planned provocation from the American side aimed at discrediting Polish officers, because immediately after the incident, 2 Americans approached Belkovich, offering him assistance in reporting the whole incident to South Vietnamese police. Poles, however, refused. They didn't want to fulfill any kind of report. The Polish relations with PRG. At the start of 1975, we can read in one of the memos sent back to Warsaw that working meetings in Camp Davis have become systematic, which actually suggests that before that they were kind of ad hoc, organized in ad hoc fashion. And also we have reflections like, in many cases, the information provided by the PRG representatives contain elements of disinformation that do not correspond with the actual state of affairs. Some of this information is purely of propaganda nature, and some of it is based on press materials. And also, Vietnamese comrades frequently treat cooperation on assistance and information as one-sided story. And the military information from the battlefield provided by the PRG representatives includes mostly data published by the media. The speaker uses a map, but only to indicate towns or general areas or direction of action. The content of the information tends to be reporter-like, which with no depth analysis from military point of view or conclusions. Yes, and no data on the preparations and tactics of the popular forces, only confirmation after the press or radio of the successes achieved by the units of the Liberation Army. Characteristically, in the early days of our work, comrades from the PRG used a map during briefing, on which the presence of units in the Saigon Army was marked schematically with arrows without description. In 1975, this map has been replaced by maps without any situation mark on them. So the Poles were not exactly informed in very good manner by PRG about current situation. And we can move to Hungarians. So the Hungarians were the other delegation in ICCS, and by the logic, there should be a close cooperation between Poles and Hungarians, and also between Polish military intelligence and Hungarian military intelligence. That was not the case, actually. Only in, I think, January 1974, there was a formal meeting when both sides agreed that there is a need to establish proper cooperation. So for the first whole year in South Vietnam, actually, they worked completely apart. And in 1975, the operational contacts with Hungarians were kept open and were described as cooperation was good. The cooperation was carried out under conditions of mutual understanding and friendship, which is communists saying that it exists. It's not exactly great, it's not exactly very bad, it just exists, more or less. There was also kind of interesting anecdote about the fact that Thomas Polgar, the guy identified earlier, he was described in Polish reports as a Hungarian Jew who organizes special briefings to the Hungarian delegation, which was kind of suspicious from Polish perspective. Also because the Hungarians were described as yes, they were described as problematic from the point of view that large percentage of the Hungarian delegation were citizens of known nationality. So this was kind of code name for Jews. So Polish military intelligence actually saw that there is some kind of, you could say, plot or cooperation, more on the ethnicity basis than, you know, international interests of the communist countries, however you want to name it. They saw something suspicious in those contacts. And due to the developments of the military political situation in Vietnam, the fall of Saigon government, and also recalling of all military officers of the Polish delegation back to Poland, resident rural country ceased to exist on the 8th of May 1975. Although some Polish officers actually remained in Saigon, and I don't know is it true, but because it's some kind of anecdote from the memoirs of one of those officers, that for some reason after North Vietnamese captured Saigon, they didn't allow to screening of any movies, and only Poles actually showed some kind of Polish movies, and because of that they were quite widely recognized in Saigon. I don't know if it's any true in that recollection, but I read something like that. And also on the very ending note, and this is the last slide, from Polish perspective, the Vietnam War functions in Polish public consciousness mainly through the intermediary of U.S. mass culture, mainly film movies. But there is one exception. There is one exception, and it is the word Saigon, which was adopted into Polish language, and it's found a way into our common vocabulary, and it is synonym for the mess. For example, that you have a real Saigon in your room and you should clean up. So yeah, and this is the end. Thank you very much.
Just checking, this is a new mic, so it seems to work. Thank you to my colleagues who have set me up with such excellent presentations both. Mine will look very, very different. The documentary material that I want to show you is not archival, and it's not in the public media. Instead, It is composed largely of photographs that were shared with me by a participant in the operation to decommission the research reactor, which was placed in Dalat. And I'll tell you a little bit about that as we wait apprehensively for the slides to appear. There it is, so you get a sense of it. This is actually a more modern photograph. But the shell of the reactor remained. After the episode that I'm going to tell you about, the reactor has been redesigned and within that shell rebuilt and is operational right now. The reactor was a part of the Atoms for Peace project of the United States, of which the Soviet Union had a parallel program to deliver research reactors, principally for medical and isotope reduction use, to client states or allies across the world during the 1950s. The U.S. Atomic Energy Commission approved the delivery of a research reactor to the Republic of Vietnam in 1959. There were a number of discussions about how that actually should occur. Those discussions took place mostly during 1959 and 1960. The geological studies were conducted 60 to 61, and the construction of the reactor began in late 1961. It achieved its criticality, first safe criticality, which I'm not sure exactly what all that means, but that's from an IAEA document, International Atomic Energy Authority Administration, in February of 1963. Any way to bring those all up so that we can see them? It's just slow? Okay, then I need to not be docked in the time for this presentation. But I think the first couple are not perhaps as important as the later ones. They're situational to describe the military advances of the NVA toward Dalat in late March 1975, with which I think most of us are familiar. There we go. That's the actual reactor, probably the shell, I'm sorry, in 1991 or 2. I was working with a graduate student at the University of Michigan and the College of Engineering who supplied me with this document, this piece. So the work that I want to just talk to you about today has to do with the removal of the LEU fuel from that reactor in early March of 1975. The exact dates remain classified. So this is the operational situation largely in South Vietnam, with which I think everyone is familiar. I just wanted to show these are the landward attacks into the central, into the western highlands, and I didn't bring my little pointer. Dalat is the provincial capital of Tuyn Duc, and you'll see that this slide shows the advance toward Ban My Thuat, which is the provincial capital just to the north. And so at late March 1975, Dalat is not yet in the immediate crosshairs, but clearly the situation is developing in that direction. And this is the situation at the end of March. And I'll just, if I can, indicate that here is the provincial line of North Vietnam's advance with main force troops. Tuyn Duc is here and Dalat is in the center of it. Next, I think. So this is the reactor itself that was approved for delivery and then became operational at Dalat in February of 1963. This is a cross-section. It's a very, very simple design. The idea is, again, on the basis of low enriched uranium, or LEU, to create isotope production. The applications of those isotopes, which have very short lives, would be in medical applications only. And what I want to bring out to you is that there were names for these reactors. They were called TRIGAs. That was an acronym for training research isotopes. That was the purpose of the reactor. They were manufactured by the General Atomics Corporation of Southern California. And these are some of the dates that I've discussed with you in terms of how this actually happened. The fuel came under IAEA regulation as, let me see, I have the date here. I think it's after criticality. It is. 1964. Previous to that, this was strictly a bilateral agreement between the United States and South Vietnam, and that will have implications for how the fuel was removed. Next. The background to this is a profile of the ownership of the reactor itself and of the fuel that comes from a US DOE document, Department of Energy document. The owner of the reactor was, in legal terms, the US Atomic Energy Commission. It was operated by a local entity within South Vietnam, but not by the South Vietnamese government. Again, this had legal implications for how the decommissioning was carried out under the crisis situation that prevailed in April 1975. You see, the Republic of Vietnam is not in this equation. The other part that's operational for us in thinking about what happened in April 1975 is that the US Atomic Energy Commission no longer existed in 1975. The reason for that had to do with the full-on crash of the Nixon administration in 1974 and a congressional mandate that this AEC institution, among other US institutions in the federal government, would be defunded on the 30th of December in 1974. And there was no AEC during the crisis period that we're looking at. That has implications, I think, as well. Next. So my source, if you want, was a member of the technical mission. His name is Ed Bramlett. I met him at a conference, not unlike this one, in Seattle some years ago. And we were talking, he's a health physicist, which means a nuclear engineer who's trained to assess how nuclear fission products interact with the human body. And as a health physicist, he was employed on the technical mission, the post-AEC technical mission sent by the federal government by one of the successor institutions to the AEC, which is called the ERDA, the Energy Research and Development Administration. And Ed said, do you want some pictures of what we did to get fuel out of Vietnam? And I said, oh, sure, yeah. And so these are the pictures that you'll see. This is actually an Air Force promo photo of Johnston Atoll, or JA, as the base is called. It was claimed by the United States first by private citizens operating under an 1856 law, which said that private citizens were allowed to claim any island in the Pacific for US, as part of the US domain if it had guano on it, because it could be used for fuel. No kidding, can't make this stuff up. There was a dispute between the US and the Kingdom of Hawaii, which is an interesting background to all of this. You can guess who prevailed. And in 1934, the island was given by the Roosevelt administration to the Navy, and in 1948 transferred to the US Air Force. And those of you who are thinking about nuclear testing in the Pacific can understand why that was the case. So this is actually, again, a promo photo from the USAF, and this is what Johnston Atoll itself looks like. In the previous slide, there was a smaller island in the foreground called Sand Island, but Johnston Atoll is the bigger of the islands in this group that has the airstrip on it. It was in the 70s and remains now completely closed. Of course, you can't access this. We don't know all the facilities that were there in 1975, and of course we don't know now. But these are Bramlett's photos. He was on the ground in April 1975 as the cargo was brought from South Vietnam. So my discussion of what's happening inside South Vietnam is now suspended, and we're talking about what's happening on the atoll where the cargo, which is the removed fuel rods from the trigger reactor and the handling tools, were brought. This is the C-141. Bramlett was already on the ground at the atoll awaiting, and it was part of U.S. military airlift command. And one of the issues is, where did this aircraft come from? As you saw on the maps, Dalat is quite well removed from Tan Son Nhut, which would have been the largest of the airstrips that, even under the chaotic conditions in April 1975, could handle an aircraft of this size. And again, it's a U.S. Air Force aircraft rather than naval. So they would have probably operated from Tan Son Nhut, but how the fuel and the handling items that we'll talk about later arrived at Tan Son Nhut would be a question. I have a theory, but I can't demonstrate any evidence for it. The theory is that there was a smaller airstrip, or was near Dalat at the time, that was used to bring these articles out of Dalat down to Tan Son Nhut, where this aircraft then was employed. And I think you will, when we see what the stuff actually looked like, get a sense that, yeah, a small plane could have handled that. Thanks. So these are the members of the USAF crew that flew that flight on the C-141. And Ed Bramlett wrote me a set of notes about these photographs, and he said, yeah, here you can see them all standing to attention after the flight with the base commander to the far left. But of course they're not. You can see they're all looking, it's like a 19th century photo where everyone's looking in a different direction. Next. This is the operation of removing the cargo, as he called it, from the C-141. The base personnel are on the right. The ground crew are all very curious as to what's happening here. And the only thing that they're going to be concerned with is the cargo. There are no refugees being evacuated on this flight out of Saigon. The personnel that Dr. Bramlett told me about here include representatives from the USERDA, civilian contractors. You can see the shorter gentleman in the t-shirt in the middle is probably a civilian contractor, and USAF personnel. This is the sum total of what they physically removed from the reactor shell: 2 drums and 2 boxes of material, and we'll see that it's actually a very small amount of stuff for a C-141 to be carrying. This is where they were taking it. It's called Bunker 723 on Johnston Island. And okay, this is the next slide. We'll see the bunker again in a minute. It's okay, there's not too much to know, right? The entire elevation of Johnston Atoll is apparently 7 feet above sea level. I think they're lucky with that. And here, that's fine. And here are the guys standing around, and we'll see a lot of standing around watching these 2 drums and 2 wooden boxes. The subtext of that is that there's a lot of stuff left at Dalat. Okay, I mean, yes, it's a very small reactor, only about 20 feet across in terms of the interior design of it, not the shell. But they didn't bring everything. Next. The drums are the pallet. Hang on one second. The boxes were just the first time you can see them in these slides that he provided me with, are in the center. And you can see an orange stripe, just barely, on a wooden box. That's the boxes. Next. So here they're moving the drums into the bunker, or actually half of the bunker. So Ed Bramlett is taking these photographs, and here are some of his buddies. The man in shorts on the left with his hands in his pockets and a white shirt is someone that he named to me. Perhaps it's not best that I name him here. But also on the right, in the group on the right, this gentleman here, wearing a hat and with his back to us in a white shirt, is the Johnston Atoll safety officer. And so there was someone on the ground who was not a part of the removal squad, who was also operationalizing this work. Hard at work, watching work is what Ed Bramlett said to me. So this is also what Dr. Bramlett said. This is the military inspection of the cargo, which apparently involves an Air Force, a couple of Air Force personnel in tennis shoes. It's kind of, yep, that looks like a barrel. What's interesting to me is that there are other barrels there, and that there's clearly, this is a depot. And the graphics on the barrel in the front, you can see on the lower right, and if you want to look, you can come up and look more closely. It really shows that it's from another trigger reactor somewhere. But that would have been standard, right? Because the United States is manufacturing the low-enriched uranium fuel, providing it to these trigger reactors at Atoms for Peace states, and then when that fuel supply has exhausted its life, it's replaced. So this makes sense. They already had a system for moving material out of trigger reactors, including South Vietnam. So those were the barrels, and this, Dr. Bramlett told me, was non-radioactive cargo. I mean, he's a health physicist, right? We trust him. There are two boxes. The lower and the larger has the identifying orange stripe. I guess this was the version of like scanning. You know, when you go to the supermarket, this is what they're, that's the one we're dealing with. They both have the orange stripes on them. You can see that there's a lot of writing on that box, and I could only make out some of it. I'm sure with resolution enhancement, there's a way, you know, this is beyond me, I'm just a historian. But we'll, I think, look at the box on the top, but the larger one has what I could make out, USERDA, which is the successor organization to the Atomic Energy Commission that we're talking about, and the name of another health physicist who I also met, who is also very kind to me. His name is John Horan. And you can make out the word Dalat. So we'll look, I think, at the other box. And here it is. This is, to me, the most interesting slide of all of the ones that Dr. Bramlett showed me. This is the box with the fuel handling tools. You can see, and I've said, this is a high-tech radiation containment package, which looks to me like something that I could bang together in my garage if I really, had an afternoon. The team who were involved are identified. John Horan, again, and W.F. Hendrickson. And the reactor facility, Dalat, is actually on there twice. There are some jokey bits scrawled on here, like, don't drop this tool, stuff like that. But there's also a list on the upper right of what this box contained to save you, I presume, from opening it. Something called a flexible fuel handling tool. But also, again, stuff I have in my garage. A hammer, a screwdriver, an Allen, next. And it's all going in the bunker. And here we see the USAF personnel locking it up. And this is bunker 723. I think, and this is Ed Bramlett taking these photos, I think he was especially happy with this photo because it appealed to his sense of humor. The Air Force personnel with all the warning signs are locking this with two padlocks. Again, Home Depot, you could literally, you can see that that's what they're doing. Two different padlocks. There's some really banged up fire extinguishers in the back. The big no smoking sign, and the Air Force personnel smoking on the top. So this is the C-141 leaving from Johnston Atoll, and Dr. Bramlett said that they're just off on another routine mission. And that's kind of how his gauge was set, which I think is helpful to be a participant in an operation like this. But I might just note that back in Dalat, North Vietnamese engineers, of course knowing this facility backwards and forwards would be my guess, approached in the crisis situation of the first week of April 1975 and later reported that there was above reasonable levels of radioactivity they found on the site. They reported that they had 3 injuries and 1 death as a consequence of interacting with what was left at the reactor shell site. And it's unclear what, if any, responses there were to that report by the United States. I haven't seen anything like that, but the records from this period, as I've indicated, are quite chaotic because the administrative control is also chaotic. It's useful, though, to know that in 1997, the IAEA and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam issued a joint statement in which the IAEA signed on to a statement that a small amount of plutonium had been found on this site in Dalat in 1975 and 76. What plutonium would have been doing there is a rather open question, but it indicates that there was chaos. If health physicists and technical decommissioners, even working with an Allen wrench, didn't remove that. But we have an international body which says that this was present. The problem, of course, is between 1975 and 1997, who put plutonium there, if indeed it was resident at the time of the decommissioning. So these are sets of open questions and bear greater examination. I also often think that's one of the best things about conferences is that you get to present material that is not yet wrapped up and closed. And so that's what I've tried to do here today, and I hope that it's been helpful to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Mr. Brower, Dr. Slowiak, and Dr. Calkins. And what I would like to do is open the floor up for any comments or questioning. If you do, please come up to the microphone to speak so that everybody can be able to hear.
Sorry I didn't catch you earlier in the conference here. The answers to your questions, there were 10 tasks. They were flown out of the lot of C-130 Constitute. I received this document about 3 weeks ago, and I sent a copy to Sean, and I hadn't really thought about it until I see your name here, and I remember when I was retyping it, that there was 2 pages on this incident in a fair amount of detail. But I think when you present this again, you'll have a lot more to add. Horn's name is here, the number of tasks, a lot of other detail. And as I say, Sean's got the original document that SyncPack sent me about 3 weeks ago.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate your contributions. It's nice to see you. I will be very interested in the provenance of the documents.
SyncPack command history,
Brilliant.
frequent wind.
Lovely. Thank you, and I look forward to having a closer look at that. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Kelly. Especially thanks to Dr. Laura Caldwell about your presentation. It happened that my aunt and uncle were directly involved at the Dalat Research Center. My aunt, she wrote, it's not an autobiography because it's only circulated within the family about the specialist from the U.S. coming back to Dalat to remove the rods. So I took the picture of your presentation, and I'll be communicating with my aunt and uncle regarding this. And there was a lot involved in the whole process. My uncle, he came to the United States to be trained to do all of that. So they built that center there. So when the communists took over, their immediate thought was that my uncle and aunt were making bombs. So, but yeah, it was just purely research, making isotope for medical application. And I think they were looking into agricultural application as well. I hope that I got your email address. We'll be in touch. Thank you so much. And then regarding the other two panelists, I learned a lot. Thank you for the presentation. My aunt and uncle right now live in Canada. Yes.
This is wonderful, and I think this is the way that we find out a great deal about the personal and as well as the professional elements behind episodes like this, and we begin to see things, I think, in more dimensions than government-to-government interactions. And so I'm grateful for your contribution, and I look forward to talking with you.
Well, I mean, in general, what a wonderful panel. I think this has been so interesting. I guess I have a question for Walter and a question for Laura. For Walter, I wondered about the impact of the Citizenship Act in 1977 and what the kind of new nationality laws in Canada, if that had an impact on the refugee situations and the decisions to like accept or not accept. And then, because I know there's quite a bit of, like there was talk of maybe settling refugees in the Falkland Islands, for example, and the Falkland Islands were like having none of it. And so in general, I know Commonwealth countries were undergoing sort of a weird situation because of the changing citizenship laws in these different countries, including, I think in Canada it was 77, which fits kind of nicely into this time period you're talking about. And then Laura, I too was struck by how small the amount of material, because I was thinking about other decommissioned nuclear reactors, and there's one in Antarctica in 1972 where they took out 12,000 tons of contaminated soil. And I guess I'm wondering, what were the concerns at the time, if we're thinking about, like, you know, we have all these concerns about Agent Orange now, and these long-term kind of environmental issues. Were there concerns in the 70s during this about, like, the possibility of these environmental long-term consequences, or was it more just like about security?
Thank you for the question. For the first part, the short answer is I honestly don't really know, because it seems to be not really mentioned anywhere in the literature of the citizenship laws in 77. The spark seems to come more from the fact of that in 1979 the UN was having the refugee, I can't remember the full name, meeting, and that actually put a lot of pressure on countries to accept refugees. But there was also a huge domestic movement of actually the Jewish community, who saw a lot of what happened to them in the 1940s when they were denied entry into Canada, happening to Vietnamese refugees in 1975 and then up to 1979. And basically going, we're not going to allow to happen to them what happened to us. And that's what sparked more of the refugee intake or the large national support.
So like the changing laws, you didn't see really much impact of that?
No, not much. And I haven't really looked at that, to be honest. The only thing that really made a huge difference was the 1978 change in immigration law, which allowed private entities to sponsor refugees instead of it only being through government channels. So I hope that answer or non-answer is satisfactory.
Dr. McKay. I first would say that Steve has told us that there was a great deal more, and so we'll look into that document, a great deal more that was removed. I would also point to the distinction that Dr. Bramlett made to me, which was that there was radioactive cargo and non-radioactive cargo. So that suggests to me that there's something particular about the tool, the flexible fuel removal tool, that its design was more important, and that it not be left behind was more important. But I would point back to the administrative disconnects in Washington that were a follow-on from the ending of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission itself, and also the disconnect that must have been in place to have only presented a decommissioning team in Dalat in the face of the kind of crisis that we're talking about here, and that it was done so quickly that there seemed to be no attempt to even assess what a remediation would require. It seems very much, in speaking to him and also in speaking to John Horan, whose name was listed on the box, that this was what we would think of as a surgical attack. They came in, there were very specific things that they were going to remove. They didn't want to leave their tools behind, and that is what was removed without any sense, really, of a longer environmental trail behind the operation of the reactor. I would also just point to the fact that the reactor was not destroyed, the shell. And that may be a consequence of no time, but it may also, these weren't the people who would have done that, obviously, but I think also it's possibly a consequence of realizing that if there was a longer environmental track that was going to unfold, that blowing up the infrastructure would have made it worse. Those are just my initial thoughts on that.
I had a question, but it's the same question, about all the leftover and the other contaminations and the fact that they look kind of amateurish handling this radioactive
Yes,
material.
I agree with you completely. It does look very bare bones. So that's another signal to me that this occurred without forethought, without a great deal of planning, and that it was done. Maybe a health physicist wouldn't appreciate this phrase, but quick and dirty, I think. And I don't have a good sense of the SRV's subsequent assessments of the site, although I'm sure that those were done and probably are of so little interest that they're now archived, would be my guess.
All right, I do have a question for Mr. Brower. My master's thesis is very similar along your lines. I actually did Vietnamese immigration to Texas. And as far as I can recall, this is over 20 years ago, I recalled the different waves of migration, the 1975 group that came over, the refugees, the boat people, and I was wondering if Canada had a humanitarian operations scheme that was set up for those who went through the re-education camps.
I believe not. I think Canada was really just busy with influx more than anything else. And a lot of the support that was provided would have been supported by the private groups, which in a lot of cases were church groups and other who would have provided services. But as far as I've been able to tell, no, there's no like dedicated organization going around making sure that people have these have the supports that they needed. And it was more of an informal process.
Yeah, that is interesting. It did remind me of the U.S. policy in 1975, where a lot of states had VOLAGs, or volunteer agencies, that did bring the refugees in and resettled within the state in that more of the private format. Right. If there are no further questions, I would like to give a round of applause for Mr. Brower, Dr. Slowiak, and Dr. Calkins. And we have about 7 minutes.